Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving into a genuinely fascinating literary experiment. We're taking William Shakespeare's absolute masterpiece, The Tragedy of Hamlet, and figuring out how to transform it from a stage play into a visceral, high-stakes, psychological Gothic novel. We're literally stripping away the stage directions, the dialogue tags, and all that theatrical pageantry. Instead, we're plunging right into the dark, internal dread of these characters. It's an absolutely incredible way to look at the source text through a completely new, chilling lens. Right from the jump, we plunge the readers straight into the freezing, oppressive fog of Elsinore. We open with Francisco's chilling whisper from the very first scene. "'Tis bitter cold, and I am sick at heart." Now, on a stage, an actor conveys this with their body language, right? Shivering, looking around. But in our novelization, we use this exact quote to anchor your physical senses immediately. It's not just bad weather we're talking about. It's a creeping psychological sickness that perfectly sets the stage for the entire nightmare to come. Section 1. Building a Gothic Elsinore. Let's look at how we establish this setting. To make this work on the page, we have to ditch the traditional stage directions entirely and rely purely on atmospheric world building. We pull a brilliant juxtaposition straight from the text to illustrate the core environmental conflict. On one hand, you have the rotting kingdom of King Claudius. This is a world of heavy-headed revel, right? You can practically hear the kettle drum and trumpet braying out his triumphs in these warm, brightly lit halls. But we clash that directly against the silent, freezing ramparts outside, where a portentous figure walks in the dark. It creates this immediate, deeply unsettling tension between the noisy, fake warmth of the usurper's court and the cold, terrifying truth waiting out in the dark. To really build this world in prose, we have to anchor the reader's senses using these highly specific, vivid motifs that Shakespeare already gives us. We describe the dawn not just as a sunrise, but as a russet mantle clad over the dew. We emphasize the literal, heavy, suffocating fabric of the inky cloak representing Hamlet's grief. We also weave in the fragile beauty of a violet in the youth of priming nature to represent Ophelia's doomed innocence. And hanging over literally everything is this pervasive, rotting stench of Denmark as an unweeded garden possessed by things rank and gross. We're turning the physical world into a direct mirror of the kingdom's moral corruption. Moving on to Section 2, Deep Psychological Interiority. Because, let's be real, in any good Gothic novel, the most terrifying haunted house isn't the castle, it's the human mind. So, the absolute crux of this adaptation is how we handle Hamlet's famous antic disposition. On stage, this is usually played as a really clever, calculated act. But in our novel, it becomes a terrifying, genuine blurring of sanity. We get to dive deep into his internal monologue. It isn't just a performance anymore. It's a frantic, sleepless fighting inside his own heart. When he contemplates to be or not to be, we frame it as a desperate, exhausting internal struggle against the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune. You, the reader, feel his intellectual paralysis firsthand. And it's not just Hamlet. We track this psychological decay across the entire cast. We bring the reader uncomfortably close to Claudius. We don't just listen to his confession, we describe the agonizing physical sensation of his stubborn knees refusing to bend. We make you feel the suffocating weight of a bosom black as death because he literally cannot surrender the crown and the queen he murdered for. And as for Ophelia, instead of just having her walk on stage and sing, we narrate the absolute fracturing of her mind. We use the rosemary for remembrance and pansies for thoughts as these tragic physical manifestations of her severe isolation and profound grief. Next up, Section 3. Dramatizing pivotal beats. How do we make the action pop? Well, to translate the play's action into gripping prose, we need to inject visceral horror right into the narrative's biggest moments. Take the moment the ghost reveals the murder. On stage, it's a monologue. But in our novelization, we dramatically slow down the pacing of this encounter in the cellarage. We do this to make the horror feel incredibly immediate. We focus entirely on the terrifying, stealthy pouring of that leprous distilment into the porches of the sleeping king's ears. And we absolutely do not look away from the physical consequences of that poison. We focus heavily on the bodily sensations the ghost describes, the poison that posits and curds like eager droppings into milk, the thin and wholesome blood. By aiming our prose directly at that vile, Lauser-like crust barking about the smooth body, we make the old king's assassination physically repulsive, undeniably real, and frankly, stomach-churning for the reader. Then, of course, we have the famous mousetrap scene. Here, we narrate the rising panic entirely from Hamlet's hyper-focused, totally obsessive perspective. We describe how he rivets his eyes to the king's face in the dim lighting, As the play within a play essentially mirrors the secret murder, we build that suffocating tension tighter and tighter until it finally snaps. We capture that sudden chaotic moment when Claudius breaks, frighted with false fire, rising up and frantically demanding light to escape the darkness of his own overwhelming guilt. In the Queen's closet, we push that dread even further. The tension peaks as the ghost makes a monstrous reappearance to whet Hamlet's almost blunted purpose. We tap into that terrifying imagery of the sepulchre that has oped his ponderous and marble jaws to cast the spirit back up. And honestly, the true psychological terror in this scene is that while Hamlet is speaking to this horrifying specter, Gertrude looks across the room and sees nothing but a chilling vacancy. Section 4. Crafting the prose tone. So to sustain this heavy level of Gothic dread throughout an entire novel, the actual language has to dictate the rhythm of the character's psychological descent. We are essentially adapting Shakespeare's masterful pacing right into our sentence structure. For scenes of frantic madness, like right after the ghost appears, we use wild and whirling words, short, breathless, totally chaotic sentences that mimic sheer panic. But then we contrast that heavily with slow, deliberate, contemplative sentences later on. During the graveyard meditations, when Hamlet realizes that imperious Caesar has literally turned to clay, the prose itself slows down, becoming heavy with the inevitable dread of human mortality. Finally, Section 5, the final rites. We reach the climax. This is where all that simmering internal dread we've built up manifests into absolute, bloody reality. For the duel, we strip away the grand, swashbuckling pageantry of stage combat. Instead, the prose hones in purely on the breathless terror of the moment. We zoom way in on the palpable hit of the laced foil breaking the skin. We drag out the sudden, horrific realization of the poisoned cup as it works its way through the bloodstream. And as the bodies start to fall, we treat the rest is silence, not just as Hamlet's last spoken words, but as a heavy, suffocating physical presence that suddenly fills the blood-soaked room. And, staying completely true to the source text, our novelization does not conclude with some beautiful, romantic soliloquy. Instead, we end on a note of cold, inevitable reality. Fortinbras arrives, this total outsider stepping over the threshold into the carnage. The story closes with the harsh, metallic machinery of Fortinbras ordering the soldiers' music and the rites of war to be spoken over a kingdom of corpses. Which brings us to our final thought for this explainer. Transforming this classic text in this way allows us to feel the horror of the story in a profoundly intimate, terrifying way, leaving us to wonder, when the heavy-headed revel finally ends and the wild words stop, when the rest is just a physical, heavy silence, how long does the rot of Elsinore truly linger in the mind? Thanks for exploring this brilliant adaptation concept with me. Keep learning, keep questioning, and I'll catch you on the next one.